So before the Reformation, pretty much all Christians in Europe were Roman Catholic. Yes, there were other types of Christians in Eastern Europe and Asia and Africa, but Roman Catholicism was the dominant form of Christianity and had been since like the 4th century. The Protestant Reformation broke so-called Western Christendom into 2 and then 3 and then 4, until finally there were uncountable denominations of Christianity. Not just Lutherans, but Apostolic Lutherans and Reformed Lutherans and Free Lutherans and Lutherans for just going back to being Catholic because this has become so complicated. This was hugely important. It changed people's way of looking at themselves and the world. It led to wider European literacy and eventually forced governments to grant religious freedoms, while also at the same time maybe being more of a political revolution than a religious one. So during the European Middle Ages, the Catholic Church really dominated European civilization. It's almost impossible to imagine the scope of the Church's power in the Middle Ages, but let's try. First off, the Catholic Church was the caretaker of the most important thing that Christians had, their souls, which, unlike our temporal bodies, were eternal. And then there was the parish priest, who played a pivotal role throughout every person's life, baptizing them, marrying them, hearing their confessions, providing last rites. The Church also provided all of the social services. It distributed alms to the poor and ran orphanages and provided what education was available. And most Europeans would, in their lives, meet exactly one person who could read the Bible, which was only available in Latin: their parish priest. And the Church owned over 1/3 of all the land in Europe, which helped make it the most powerful economic and political force on the continent. And the Pope claimed authority over all the kings of Europe as the successor to the Roman Emperor. So this was a very powerful institution, and it was undone by one chronically constipated monk. Here at Crash Course, we don't like to get too into like great man history, but the Reformation really was initiated and shaped by one man, Martin Luther. No, Stan, the Martin Luther he was named for. No, Stan, the Martin Luther that he was named for, yes. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. Luther studied law, and like most law students, he hated it. Then one day, a sudden storm blew up, lightning struck him to the ground, and in a panic, he cried, "Help me, Saint Anne, I'll become a monk." He survived, and in the next 2 weeks, he withdrew from university, entered an Augustinian monastery, took his vows, and sent a message to inform his family, who I'm sure were delighted to have spent all that money on education because monking is so lucrative. In 1505, Luther was sent to Rome on a diplomatic mission, and he ignored all the awesome art and focused instead on Rome's corruption, with prostitutes openly soliciting on the filthy streets, priests who made light of their duties hurrying through Mass so fast that it seemed to mean nothing, and openly deriding church doctrine. Luther was obsessed with his own sinfulness, and he kept confessing incessantly, and finally his confessor and teachers sent him to the University of Wittenberg because, you know, they were a little bit annoyed with him, and they figured he'd be good at teaching scripture. These days, of course, incessant confessors are put on the Real Housewives of New Jersey, but back then you sent them to the University of Wittenberg. Anyway, Luther finally found his answer in St. Paul's epistles, specifically in one line that said, "The just shall live by faith." In other words, salvation comes through faith, not good works, not through prayer or fasting or vigils or pilgrimages or relics or giving to the poor or the sacraments or any action that a person can take. We can't ever be good enough through our actions to merit salvation. We can only have faith. In Latin, sola fide. Only faith. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Martin Luther's new interpretation of sola fide grew into a full-scale conflict with the Catholic Church when a friar named John Tetzel came to Wittenberg selling indulgences. An indulgence was a donation to the Church that came with a promise from the Pope to reduce a sinner's time in purgatory. Like, to quote from an indulgence that Friar Tetzel sold, "I replace thee in the state of innocence and purity in which thou wert at the hour of thy baptism." Luther felt like that wasn't the sort of thing that, you know, should be for sale. The price of this whole life complete forgiveness of any horrible sin certificate, by the way, was 3 marks, probably about half a year's wages for a laborer. So Luther didn't like seeing his parishioners handing over money that they didn't have for a scrap of paper that he believed to be meaningless. So in response, he wrote 95 theses against indulgences and then dramatically nailed them to the church door for all to see on October 31st, 1517, or else he mailed them to the archbishop, or possibly both. We don't actually know. This led to a series of debates with other men of the cloth, during which Luther's positions became increasingly radical. Starting from the statement that Christians were saved only through faith and the grace of God, for instance, Luther then upped the ante, saying that the Church's rituals didn't have the power to save souls. And then he argued that far from being infallible, the Church and the Pope made errors all the time. That was a pretty bold thing to say, and then it got even more dramatic when Luther ultimately denied that the Church and the officers of it had any spiritual powers. He said that the priesthood was a human invention and that individual Christians didn't even need priests to receive the grace of God. Instead, Luther described a priesthood of all believers. So this had gone from a call for reforming indulgences to a revolution. So in 1521, Luther was called to defend his ideas before the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V at the Imperial Diet of Worms, or in German, Worms. Also, let me say retroactively, now that everyone has commented on my poor German pronunciation, Wittenberg. Emperor Charles famously said, "A single friar who goes counter to all Christianity for 1,000 years must be wrong." To which Luther was like, "Stop flapping that hideous Habsburg jaw of yours." But there was something to what Charles was saying, right? Because plenty of radical friars had criticized the Church's abuses and hypocrisies over the years. Why would Luther prove influential? Well, one reason was the printing press. Now, most people in Europe at the time couldn't read, but a lot of people could, including, of course, a lot of priests, and over 2,000 editions of Luther's writings appeared between 1517 and 1526. And his ideas also appeared in pamphlets and posters and cartoons that were seen and read aloud, reaching millions of readers and listeners. In short, Luther's ideas were all over like the Tumblr of the day, which was a town crier and broadsides nailed to doors. And it caused quite a stir, especially the stuff about like the Pope being the Antichrist sent by the devil. Like I said, it got pretty radical. But maybe the most revolutionary of Luther's publications was his new translation of the Bible into German. For the first time ever, non-priests could read the Bible for themselves because Luther used the German that people actually spoke instead of Latin, and his work quickly caught on among common people. Hundreds of thousands of copies of Luther's Bible were printed, people carried it in their pockets and memorized it. Now everyone could quote scripture and discuss its meaning. Now Luther